Good morning, everybody. I'm Leif Nelson, and thanks for coming to the Data Colada seminar series. Sorry about all of the delays and our technical errors, but I'm so glad you all could make it. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Nick Yeung. In addition to Nick, we have a number of outstanding panelists joining us: Jen Log, Don Moore, Nicolo Pescatelli, and Christina Rader. In addition to them, we have Joe and Yuri Simonson, who are with us here as always. If you have any comments or questions during the seminar, I invite you to submit them through the Q&A function. There's a chat function at the bottom of the screen. Don't use that. It doesn't work well for what we're trying to do, but the Q&A function, it's amazing. You should really try it out. So those are the basic details. Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Leif. Let me check my screen is being shared there. Great. So yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. And I'm really excited. Thanks to the panelists too for joining to discuss with you guys. This work that I'm going to be talking about on confidence, trust, and adaptive decision-making. So the background is going to be thinking about the way people make decisions, and we can think about sort of very transient, inconsequential decisions about whether to turn left or right at a junction, or perhaps a more cognitively involved, demanding, substantive, consequential decision, like a doctor deciding what to prescribe in terms of treatment for a patient. We're thinking about the idea in particular that alongside these kinds of decisions, these commitments to actions and decisions that people make, they have an accompanying sense of confidence that the decision that they're making is the good or a bad one, or the correct or the incorrect one. And so I'm going to be focusing on this idea that as individuals make decisions, they have an accompanying sense of confidence. And I'm going to think about the function of those, both for individuals making decisions alone, but also for people making decisions in groups of individuals. And in the background, I'm going to be interested in these real world decisions. What the sorts of decisions I'm going to be talking about in most of the experiments are, I guess, reflecting my background in cognitive psychology, these sorts of decisions that are shown at the bottom here. So although in the background, I'm going to be interested in these kind of real world decisions about, well, that's the kind of target we're trying to understand. We're going to try and understand it through studying how people make decisions about simple perceptual stimuli, like, for example, judging, are there more dots in the left or the right hand box? Or are there more, if looking at this set of colored patches, is the average color of these colored patches more red or more blue? On the assumption that there's something important shared between those. And I think particularly for this audience, I'm interested perhaps at some point to explore that assumption, but certainly it's one that we typically make in these experiments. Sometimes we're brave enough to venture beyond simple perceptual decisions, and we'll ask people questions about general knowledge. So for example, we might ask people to make judgments about whether George Orwell published the book 1984 before or after the year 1950. So those are the sorts of questions I'm going to be interested in. So thinking about how people express and use their confidence in their decisions in these kinds of tasks. And a starting point for this whole enterprise is the idea that with interesting exceptions that perhaps again we might explore in discussion, a striking feature of the confidence judgments that people make is that they can be remarkably well calibrated, in the sense that the way in which people express their confidence can be tightly calibrated, tied to their objective accuracy. And this is shown, for example, by this kind of one of the earliest studies on confidence in this psychological literature by Henman over 100 years ago, who asked participants to make a simple judgment about whether the line is longer on the left or the right. And accompanying that, they were asked to say a letter that indicated how confident they were, from being perfectly confident their judgment was correct, through fairly confident with little confidence or doubtful. And Henman reported this nice degree of calibration between people's subjective judgments of confidence and their objective accuracy. So for example, when they said they were doubtful about the judgment they were making, in fact, they were about chance, with this graded accuracy through to when they say that they are perfectly confident. They weren't in fact perfectly accurate, but they were pretty accurate. So you see this calibration between people's subjective judgments and their objective accuracy. And can everybody see my cursor, by the way, as I move it around? Good, okay, that's helpful, thanks. So a basic idea then is that people can be remarkably well calibrated. And some of the interest in this domain, to kind of situate the work I'm going to talk about today, is in understanding the mechanisms underpinning these kind of judgments. Given that they're so accurate, we can ask computationally, what sorts of information are people using that enable them to make judgments about their own judgments? So how can they evaluate their decisions so accurately in interesting circumstances, and kind of in parallel and linked to that, what sorts of brain mechanisms might there be? And certainly that's an interest of mine in some of the research we do. But what I'm going to focus on, rather than how do people make these judgments, what I'm going to focus on today is the question of what do people do with these judgments? So what is the role? Why is it that we might make these confidence judgments, and what role do they play in adaptive decision making, as the title of the talk indicates? And the starting point that and the first line of work I'll talk about really reflects my background in cognitive psychology, and particularly thinking about executive function and cognitive control, with the idea that we can think about these confidence judgments as playing a role in the regulation of behavior, where we can think about these sort of regulatory feedback loops in cognition, where we might engage in various task processes, which might be around memory or decision making or problem solving, but that those basic cognitive processes don't exist in isolation and sort of work in an entirely closed loop way, but that we constantly, as actors in the world, monitoring both the consequences of the decisions we make, or the way we solve problems in the world, so the objective outcomes, but also we might monitor our own internal processes, and we might use those monitoring of the external world or our internal cognitive processes to make appropriate adjustments in how we're doing the task, or what we're doing in order to do the task better. And so we can think about these regulatory feedback loops. And so we might think about an individual decision maker, not just engaging in decisions, but constantly thinking about their decisions in order to change the way they're making those decisions to make them better in the future. And so we can think about this at the level of an individual decision maker doing this. And so this is the background for this line of work. And in particular, I was sort of inspired when getting into this literature, where I started out with this background in interest in executive functions and cognitive control, to kind of come across and learn more about a sort of parallel literature on how people use their evaluations of their memory processes. So there's a really lovely body of work that's been done in literature on memory and meta-memory, and as it pertains to education, where people have looked at these classic sort of theories and work on how people encode information in memory, but thinking about that as part of a regulated process as well, whereby people don't just learn, they constantly think about their learnings. They make, for example, judgments about how well have I encoded this information? So how well did I understand that lecture? That leads to changes in their behavior, for example, around in education, the choices of how to study and what to study. And I think I found this really inspiring, in the sense that I think that literature is really, that body of work is really thought in a kind of creative way about the sorts of flexible strategic decisions that learners make. So, for example, you might, having learned something, make a judgment of learning and decide that you've learned it well or badly. That informs not just whether you study it again in the future, or your choice of what to study, but, for example, a kind of very high-level decision about, do I need to study at all, or can I take the day off? And so the broad range of flexible strategic behaviors. And that's really sort of the way we've been thinking about the role of confidence in decision-making, as being this kind of explicit, perhaps consciously available signal that allows very flexible sorts of adaptations of behavior that can operate at various different levels and in different ways in a context-dependent way. And so the first line of work I'll talk about today is exploring that idea in the context of individual decision-making, where the theme of this a series of experiments is going to be that the value of representing your confidence, and what you can use it for, is this flexible way of adapting the way you make decisions to suit the circumstances. In the second part of the lecture, I'll build on that, and this is so Nicola, who's here on the panel today. I'm going to focus on work that he did with me as part of his PhD here in Oxford, extending that to thinking about the way in which people make decisions in social contexts, and in particular, thinking about how it is that a decision maker can use their own confidence in order to learn whether to trust others' advice. And so that's the core bit of the lecture, of the seminar, talking about confidence in decision-making. The third part builds on Nicola's work, and it was another PhD student, Matt Jackery's work, that explores a sort of related set of ideas of how, as well as thinking about how the way individuals make decisions may play out at the level of social networks, which is Nicola's work, how the kind of network context might affect the way in which you trust others. So that's the plan for today. So really focusing on confidence and adaptive decision-making in the first two lines, and then extending that to thinking about network influences on trust in the last part. So I'll start with this work on confidence in individual decisions. So the basic idea is a straightforward one, that a person's confidence in the decision they're making might usefully inform their decision making, for example, whether they need further information before committing to a final choice. And so a first experiment to kind of explore, to show the kind of experiments we can do in this, is this one from Kobe Descender, where participants are making that judgment I talked about earlier. They see a set of patches of colored stimuli, and they're deciding on average, is the color of these stimuli, these color patches, more red or more blue? So binary choice. And having made an initial choice, they're then given the option of whether they'd like a hint at some cost of seeing a stimulus where the hint is the same stimulus, but in slightly easier forms. In this case, it's made slightly more red. In the experiment that we use these stimuli because it turns out they have this interesting property that there are two ways to make the task difficult. So one way to make the task difficult is to have the colors of the patches be a mix of reds and blues. And if there's lots of variance in the color, that makes the task harder. Another way to make the task hard is to have the average color very close to the category boundary, so very purple, even if the color patches, there's not much variance in the color. And we use that because from Annika Bolt's PhD work in the lab, we knew that we can use this manipulations of having stimuli with high variance or a low mean to dissociate objective performance and subjective confidence. So for various interesting reasons, it's the case that when you can match the stimuli for difficulty, so you can have a level of variance that exactly matches the difficulty of stimuli that are very purple, so close to the category boundary. So we can match the objective accuracy with these two kinds of stimuli, but people will be systematically less confident in the case with high variance stimuli. And so what we can then do is having where performance is matched, and we can do the same kind of match it for reaction times too. So performance is matched and objective markers of behavior are pretty well matched between the two cases. Nevertheless, people are systematically more confident in the low mean stimuli. And so we can ask then, for example, is their hint-seeking behavior tied more to their objective performance than their subjective confidence, or vice versa? And of course, given the nature of my talk, I'm going to not surprise you with the data, which is that the hint-seeking behavior is tied to this subjective confidence. So it shows the same effect where they're more likely to decline a hint when they're more confident in the low mean case, even though in fact they're objectively equally accurate. So we can use these sorts of manipulations of these perceptual stimuli, which give us this tight control over the evidence we're giving people. In this case, to dissociate objective accuracy and subjective confidence and show that this hint-seeking behavior seems to be really driven by the subjective confidence. As I said, so the theme of this part of the talk is that confidence is flexible, and the part of the flexibility is that you can look at the same sort of behavior, in this case information seeking, in different contexts. And so part of the value of confidence, according to this story, is that you can do the same computation across multiple situations. That's part of the flexibility. And so in Michael Ben-Yehuda's PhD work with me, he looked at that, for example, in the context of a learning task. So now people aren't making the decisions are pretty simple, right? So on each trial, they're shown a single unambiguous stimulus. The difficulty comes in gradually learning through trial and error feedback, which is the correct response to make out of two possible responses to each of the two stimuli. So they have to learn that, for example, the clock goes with the right-hand button and the vase of flowers goes with the left-hand button through feedback that's probabilistic. And so over the course of several trials, they can learn which is the correct response to make for each stimulus. And in this task, we're asking them, in this version of standard sort of probabilistic reinforcement learning task, we're asking them to do that. And also, after each trial, tell us how confident they are that they know the rule. And what Michael showed in a series of experiments was that confidence systematically relates to the attention that participants pay to feedback. So in this case, it's the same sort of information-seeking behavior. Now, in terms of learning, it's again seems to be regulated by confidence. So, for example, he showed that behaviorally, so it's probabilistic feedback. So occasionally people are going to get feedback that tells them they made the wrong answer, but is in fact they objectively made the correct answer. And what Michael showed is behaviorally, for example, that the degree to which that uninformative, misleading negative feedback leads people to be less confident in the correct rule changes systematically as a function of their initial confidence. So the more confident they are, the more they discount this actual objectively misleading feedback. It's also reflected in their brain signals to the feedback. So there are well-characterized EEG responses to feedback that reflect the degree to which people are attending to and processing the feedback they're given. And we find that confidence is a significant negative predictor of the amplitude of those components, those EEG components. So the more confident a person is about what they know, the less attention they seem to pay, the less they process that feedback as shown through a reduced neural response to that. So that's confidence here being a negative predictor and regression on the amplitude of this, controlling for various things like, for example, how far they are into learning. And in an experiment, in further experiments, for example, Michael showed that the more confident participants are, the less willing they are to pay for feedback if they have to pay for it. Similar theme again now in a sort of starting to move into kind of judge-advisor system organizational psychology domain. So again, the same sort of task of participant making perceptual judgment, are there more dots on the left or the right-hand box? They're making an initial private judgment on their own, indicating whether they think it's the left or the right and a degree of confidence in that. And now that they're in this task, they're able to ask for advice on some trials about what the correct answer is. And if they choose that they would like advice, a virtual advisor pops up and tells them what they think it is, and the participants have the opportunity to revise their judgment. This is work that Anna Halpert did, actually, as an undergraduate project in collaboration with me and Nicolo, who's here today. A simple result I'm going to tell you about, which won't surprise you, is that the more confident participants are, the less they will ask for advice. And that sort of reflects, again, this basic idea of that your degree of confidence in your initial decision will tell you how much information it's worth seeking. So people seek less information when they're already confident than when they're initially low in confidence. So we see across the few experiments I've already described, there's one kind of theme about the flexibility of these confidence judgments, in that you can make essentially the same computation across multiple different circumstances. The more confident I am, the less need I have for external information, be it seeing a hint that I have to pay for, getting advice, or paying attention to feedback out there in the world. This experiment I'm partly talking about because it also links to another aspect of flexibility, that is that although typically what you'll find is the more confident participants are, the less advice they will seek. It's pretty simple to put people in a situation in which, in fact, they show the opposite pattern. So here's some data from a different experiment by Naomi Carlebach, where now what we see is, if we look at the people's likelihood of asking for advice as a function of how confident they are, we see the opposite pattern, where in fact they seek advice when they're most confident. Right. There are two important changes in this experiment, or two changes in this experiment. One of them is less important. It's just that actually in this experiment, the way it works, same dots task, same initial confidence judgment. In this experiment, they're choosing on each trial between, do they want advice from a virtual advisor, or do they want to see the stimulus again before revising their judgment and registering a final judgment? That's a detail. The key thing that seems to drive this behavior, and in fact was the point of the experiment, why it is that people are asking for advice when they're highly confident, is that in this experiment, participants are working with a series of advisors of different reliability, and they've got to figure out, in order to use the advice effectively, how good the advice each advisor gives is. And the intuition here is that if you don't know how good an advisor is, one thing you can do is, when you think you know what the correct answer is, when you're sure what the correct answer is, you can see if that advisor agrees with you. And so a simple heuristic you can use is, when I'm really sure what the answer is, that is when my confidence is really high, I can in that case look initially for the advice, see if the advisor agrees with me. And if they do, I'll think they're a good advisor. And if they disagree with me, I'll think they're a bad advisor. And so in this situation, we can see then the flexibility of these confidence judgments, so that typically what you do is you ask for advice when you're not sure. But if in fact what you want to do is not learn about the world, but learn about the advisor, the thing to do is ask for advice when you are actually fairly certain. And that's what people do. And then I won't go into the other experiments from Naomi's PhD thesis that explored that idea a bit further. But that gives a flavor of sort of the starting point for our research, of thinking about how it is that individuals can use their confidence judgments to behave flexibly and adaptively, for example, seeking information when they need it, and also use that information to learn about the world. So I promised that at Leif, when I started, that I would pause the breaks just in case anyone had a question or a comment. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
You've been talking about ways in which the glass of confidence is half full. My guess is that lots of people in our audience are used to thinking about the imperfections in human judgment and our vulnerabilities to bias. Even in the result you shared at the very beginning from Hanman in 1911, it was evident that although there was a strong correlation between confidence and accuracy, it was also the case that confidence was systematically biased and that it appeared to exceed accuracy. Can you comment on the simultaneous coexistence of those?
Yep, yeah. I mean, so I suppose the first comment is that's pretty ubiquitous. I think that generally, people are pretty good but not perfect, and that makes sense if you think that, and this sort of relates to some of the theories about how it is that people make these judgments, that we actually taking the memory case is a good one, where in the sense of like, do I remember something correctly, right? What information could I have? Well, we don't have perfect memory, or if I think about if is something in my memory or not, in a sense, there's no way you could have access to that. If you think of, even at a biological level of my memories are stored in my synapses, there's no way I can have access to what's in my memory. So what the best a person can do is rely on things that are correlated with whether something's in my memory. Like, for example, is it easy to bring to mind, or does the question feel familiar? And I think this goes to the question of how people are making these judgments. So what people are typically doing in these tasks, I think, this is sort of what the evidence points, right, is that people are using cues that are pretty good but imperfect. And so if you do that, then, I mean, what you'll tend to find is this general correlation, but people systematically biased. And at one level, they'll tend to be, especially in difficult tasks, overconfident. And that's what you find in these perceptual tasks, which are typically quite difficult, where in certain circumstances, it's just really, really hard. And partly just mathematically, you're bound to be overconfident. But I think there are more interesting sort of aspects to it, that if you're using cues that are imperfect, the fact that you're using them tells you, gives you a certain sense of confidence. But because those cues are imperfect, then there'll necessarily be cases where they mislead you. And so you're going to be wrong but confident, but in a way that on average makes sense, but in individual decisions might mean, and especially if you pick the conditions correctly, you're going to be systematically overconfident. And I guess that's how I tend to think about it. Is that sort of what you were getting at?
Yep, spot on.
Thanks.
It also looks like, at least in one of the studies, you removed the highest uncertainty, so 50-50. It looks like there's a gap of just total uncertainty. If you were to include that as an option, what do your results look like? I'm curious what those folks do in that kind of environment.
Yeah, so we typically force people to commit to a choice just because analytically it's easier to kind of make them, and then we can, for example, in a lot of our experiments, we look at just simple function of agreement, disagreement. If you allow people to register the fact they're guessing, then they use that quite a lot, because I think for a participant to say that they're 52% sure doesn't mean a lot different than they're guessing. And so I think people tend to often use that in quite a sensible way that reflects their experience. I don't think people, although we have this continuous scale effect, I don't think people meaningfully have the difference between 50%. I'm completely guessing and I'm 51% sure. Does that? Were there thoughts of like where that might lead analytically?
Well, I was thinking that if someone is totally uncertain, that might be matching the advice that they receive, or they could be assuming that this is just difficult for everyone. I feel like it could play out either way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing to say is from my starting point, actually, this work was looking at how in certain circumstances people know when they've made mistakes. And so especially in speeded decisions. So although that 50% point, I think, is a sensible anchor point and it has interesting properties. I mean, I tend to think of confidence as going from 100% actually to 0%, because in speeded tasks, people can be certain they got it wrong. And so although that, I think, in terms of how people use the scale and what you should do when you're completely uncertain, I think that it's, think of it as a continuum is there. And I think that the fact that people tend to use that rated scale in the middle is more just a function of a sensible thing to do if you're a subject in the task and you're just thinking, I'm guessing here, and that covers a range of kind of levels of certainty in the middle there. Okay, I might just carry on unless someone wants to speak up and stop me. Right, I will do. Okay, so next I will talk about some work that then extends this line of thinking from individuals making decisions to kind of expand on those ideas that I talked about in terms of Anna Halperich's and Naomi Karlovack's work, and thinking, and this is now Nicolo's, a line of work from Nicolo's PhD. So Nicola is very interested, as you may tell me more about, in collective intelligence. And what we looked at in this line of work in his PhD was the question of how it is that in the world where people will give you their opinions readily, how it is that you figure out whose opinions are good or bad. So you think about all the sources of information and advice out there in the world, how is it that you decide whose advice is worth listening to? In particular, given that, and maybe this is something we can discuss, in a world in which actually feedback might be difficult to get or delayed or unreliable, or in fact completely absent. So how is it that in the absence or with limited objective feedback, we might learn about whose advice is reliable? And this is actually the work that was the origin of Naomi's experiment, because you might kind of see where this is going. That Nicola's starting hypothesis was that if you are lacking any objective standard against which to judge the quality of advice you're receiving, one thing you can do is compare it against your own internal judgment about what's true. And in particular, the idea is that you can use your internal sense of confidence as a useful guide. So if I'm certain that something's correct, if I'm certain that something's true and somebody tells me that they agree with that, I can be certain that they're correct in this instance and kind of increase my trust in them. But if there's something that I think is certainly true and someone disagrees with it, I can decide on that. In this opinion, they're wrong, and so downweight their opinion in the future. And I can do this in a graded way. So someone can disagree with me, but if I don't know what's right or what's wrong, I might listen to them in the future because they might have useful information, and I can't discount them just because they disagree with me in an opinion that I, in fact, don't hold very strongly. So the idea here is you can use your own internal sense of confidence as a proxy for feedback, and learn usefully about the world. And so the starting point for Nicola's work, and what we did as part there, was some computational work just showing that, in fact, with this heuristic, which is I learn about the reliability of others to the extent that they agree with me, weighted by my confidence, you can actually learn quite subtle features about other people and their reliability, even in the absence of any objective feedback. And so a first experiment that Nicola then ran was to test this idea that people should be able to learn about subtle features about the quality of advisors, even in the absence of feedback. So it was the same sort of setup as I've talked about before. So people are doing a series of trials with these perceptual judgments. They're registering a private decision. They're getting some advice on this. In this instance, they get advice on every trial from a virtual advisor. They're allowed to update their decision. And then across participants, we vary whether they get feedback or not. So a key first variable is that across participants, some are going to get feedback on every trial, so they can in fact know objectively how good the advice they're getting is and how good their own decisions are. Other participants never get any trial by trial feedback. Okay, and we really care about the participants with no feedback, but the feedback case gives us a useful kind of control. And we're going to look at what the effect that has in terms of what participants can learn as a function of the advisors. So across the experiment, they're going to interact with 4 advisors and who are going to vary in properties. So in this case, 2 of the advisors are good at the task and give accurate advice, and 2 give inaccurate advice. And crossed with that, there are 2 advisors who give calibrated advice in the sense that when they express an opinion with confidence, so I'm sure it was on the right versus I think it was on the right, they're more likely to be correct. Okay, if people are using this confidence in agreement in confidence heuristic, they should actually be able to learn the differences between these advisors. And so that's what we're going to test. So we have various measures of who they learn to trust, but one is just to ask who you trust. And so this is that measure for the participant group who got feedback on every trial. And you can see that in their ratings of trust in the 4 advisors, they show sensitivity, both accuracy of the advice, so they trust accurate advisors more than inaccurate advisors. And they also trust calibrated advisors more than uncalibrated advisors. So that is where the confidence is predictive of objective accuracy. But of more interest is what happens for the participants who don't get feedback. And we find that they're also sensitive to these factors. So they can learn these quite subtle features of these advisors over repeated interactions, as we'd expect if they're not only if they're using this, but certainly that's the basic idea, that they're using this confidence heuristic, and so they're sensitive to the accuracy, so they can tell who's good and who's bad, but also whose confidence is predictive of performance and whose confidence isn't, and they express trust accordingly. It turns out the key thing that allows this heuristic of trusting people who agree with your confidently held opinions and learning to distrust people who disagree with your confidently held opinions working is that the judgments that the advisors give are independent of yours. Right? So it works really well if the advice is independent of yours, but if there are systematic biases such that their advice is not independent of yours, you get systematic biases in trust. So for example, in a second experiment, we manipulated this. So again, there are 2 accurate advisors and 2 inaccurate advisors, but because we're doing this all on computers, we can manipulate it such that 2 advisors crossed with that separately are likely to agree with you independently of their objective accuracy, and 2 are likely to disagree with you. So you can think of this, for example, an accurate advisor who tends to disagree with you might be one who's good at the task, but is using different information than you're using. So even though they might be as good or better than you, they might get it right when you get it wrong, sometimes, and vice versa. Again, with feedback, people learn about this. So they, again, as you'd expect, prefer accurate over inaccurate advisors. Interestingly, even when they've got objective feedback on every single trial, they like people and they trust people more who tend to agree with them more than people who tend to disagree with them. The more interesting case, again, is the one where there's no feedback. And what we find here is that now trust is dominated by agreement and shows very little effect, if any, of objective accuracy, which makes sense if the cue you're using is agreement weighted by confidence. So in the absence of feedback, people's trust ratings are dominated by the likelihood of others agreeing with them. The specific hypothesis that Nicola was interested in, though, was that this is weighted by confidence. And so in a third experiment now, what we did was the participants are going to interact with 3 advisors, all of whom are equally accurate, all of whom are going to be equally likely to agree with you. But they're going to vary in the conditions in which they agree. So one we call a kind of bias sharing advisor, in the sense that they tend to agree with you most when you are yourself confident in your judgments. The idea is they're bias sharing in the sense that perhaps they make decisions in the same way that you do. So they tend to agree with you most when you're most confident, when those cues point in that direction. And we can compare that to an unbiased advisor who's equally likely to agree with you whether you're confident or not. And what we call an anti-bias advisor, so who's one that actually tends to agree with you most when you're correct but unconfident. So it might be, again, that advisor who is using some but not all of the same information. So they'll tend to agree with you sometimes, perhaps particularly when you're unsure. Now, in the case for those participants who get feedback, what we find is that they express greatest trust and they use most the anti-bias advisor. And this is what, in fact, normatively you should do, because this is the advisor who provides the most information. The bias sharing advisor is actually pretty redundant because they only ever agree with you and you're already sure what your answer is. Because they don't tend to add much information, whereas the anti-bias advisor are actually pretty useful because they tend to agree with you when you're correct, but actually not, kind of on the fence about whether that's the correct answer. And people seem to be sensitive to that in the sense that they express greatest trust in and are most influenced by the anti-bias advisor. Whereas we see a different pattern in the case, and the predicted pattern, at least in terms of the fact that in the absence of feedback, that the advisor they like the most and are most influenced by is the one that tends to agree with them when they themselves are confident. Okay. So what we see then is this heuristic that allows you to do something that's quite difficult, which is you can learn subtle features of the quality of the advice you're getting, even without any objective feedback, but that it's subject to systematic biases where the advice you're getting or the opinions you're learning about are correlated with your own, and you tend to overtrust people whose opinions are more correlated with yours than you'd expect by the simple kind of co-occurrence of opinions if they're given independently.
Can I ask a really simple clarifying question about your trust measure? Is that a weighting of advice? It's not an explicit, how much do I trust this person? It's
that what I've just shown you in all those experiments is an explicit rating of trust. So we ask at the end of every so often people say, this is how much I trust them, this is how good I think they are, this is how influential they are. We also get measures of how influential their advice is, and generally it all goes in the same direction. There's some subtle interesting differences. So actually in the second experiment, where in the trust measure you only see effects of how likely the advisor is to agree with you and no effect of accuracy. In the influence measure, you see a subtle effect of accuracy as well, actually, which is what we expect from the if you're using that heuristic. You can, in other experiments that actually Matt Jackery, whose PhD work I'll talk about in a minute, he's also, you can look at in terms of who they choose to get advice from, and you get the same effects there as well. So all of these measures tend to go together.
Thanks.
So, so that's the experimental work. in the last part of it, Nicola did some agent-based modeling to explore the possible network implications of this. So imagine that at the individual level, this is quite a sensible thing to do, in the sense that if you've got no feedback, you can still learn really useful things about people in the world and their opinions and how good their advice is. But we started to see the possible effects of that, where you overtrust people whose advice or opinions are correlated with yours for the wrong reasons, as it were. And so in a final bit of this research, what Nicola did was build agent-based models to explore what would happen if you've got agents who act according to these rules, where they can learn about others, whether feedback's present or not, but might bring to it biases. And so the way the agent-based models work is that you've got these little agents here who are making a series of decisions, and they learn about the decisions of others, and they can learn to trust others more or less according to rules. Like if there's objective feedback, you can just see, are they right or wrong? But if there's not feedback, you can do it based on this confidence-weighted agreement. And in the simulations, the way they're set up is that there are two populations who start with initial biases. So you can think of the green people here as the green agents here as people who tend to think that there are more dots on the left, right? That's their prior, versus the red people here who tend to think there are more dots on the right. And what you can look at is then how the networks evolve. Firstly, in terms of patterns of trust. So for example, what's plotted here is quite a derived measure, so I'll just explain what it is. Basically, it's a measure of how much you trust people who have the same bias as you more than people who have a different bias from you. And that's what's this clustering metric here, where 0.5 means you have equal trust in people who share your biases versus who don't share your initial biases, with high numbers indicating more clustering, where you tend to trust more people who share your initial bias. And on the y-axis here, the key variable is the probability of feedback. And you can see that when there's feedback, it doesn't matter. When there's feedback on every trial, you tend to equally trust people who share your biases or don't share your biases. But the less and less feedback is, the more and more you tend to cluster with, in terms of over-trusting relative to others, people who share your initial biases. And Nicola also looked at then the effect that that might have actually on the beliefs of the populations. The way a further set of simulations worked is that these individuals, you can see that their biases here. So for example, you might think this bias is your prior that there are more dots on the left. So the reds who tend to think there are more left, and the greens who tend to think there are more dots on the right, and they interact with each other. But at this point on 500, they're now allowed to update their biases. They're allowed to change their priors based on their experience of the world and the opinions of others. And the different colored lines indicate different levels of likelihood of getting feedback. So the very dark lines of red and green are where there's feedback on every trial. And you can see that in that case, that these populations converge on the truth, which is that actually left and right are equally likely. But you can see as the lines get lighter, what that means is there's less and less likelihood of there being feedback. And the more feedback is, the more stable these biases are through interactions with the world and others who don't share your opinion, to the point that when there's very little feedback, the biases tend to reinforce each other and the populations become even more extreme. And that makes sense because you start to only trust people who share your initial opinion. They always tell you, for example, that it's always on the left. And so you reinforce those biases. So that the idea then is that this heuristic that makes sense for an individual, because it might be the only thing you can do if there's very little feedback, you can still learn useful things, but it can lead to this unfortunate effects at the network level in terms of clustering and a sort of a model maybe of an echo chamber forming, where you start to overtrust people who start to share your opinion. But importantly, it comes from actually a sensible choice that they're making themselves. Just in the interest of time, I will, what I'll do is I'll stop there and I'll see if there's, after that bit, there's any time for the last part.
Across all this experimental work, I had a question about the number of trials and if the patterns alter over the number of trials. So for example, with the Karlbach, where you found the positive relationship between confidence and advice seeking, I wondered if you did enough trials, if you'd start to see that alter back into the regular direction and perhaps even stronger.
Absolutely, yeah. So the other part of that analysis, part of it was to exactly that. So if it's a learning effect, what you might expect is that it's there right at the start when you're learning, but it will gradually decrease and maybe even reverse with time. We never saw it reverse because we didn't go on for long enough, but certainly you see it decrease. So in other experiments, we just told people at the start of the block, this is how good the advisor is, and you never see that pattern. So that's how we kind of know that it's linked to learning. So if you take away the need to learn, that pattern goes away. In terms of the last series of experiments, Nicola I guess maybe can probably remember better than me, we did look at time. I mean, one of the things that we find is that actually those patterns of trust are formed quite early, and mostly the large number of trials that participants went through was just to get the stable measures of influence as a function of the different levels of confidence that they have in their decisions. So they do lots of trials, and I think when I worry about the validity of these experiments, maybe I should be worrying about other things too, but one thing I definitely do worry about is that they have lots of interactions with those advisors, so on the order of about 100 with each one. In those experiments, Matt's experiments, he's replicated some of these effects with those trivia tasks. So like, was 1984 the novel published before or after 1950? And in those experiments, we have many fewer trials and get similar effects.
Great, thank you.
I don't know, Nicola, is there anything you'd add to?
No, I just, piggybacking on what Nick said, like the effect of time was like really like tiny. We decided like to average across all trials because as Nick said, like the learning was very, very quick.
I just want to remark on the ecological validity here. I mean, it seems like people are just more likely to basically, people are likely in your experiments to reach the right answer when they interact with advisors, but only when they're getting either, like if they start out biased at least, but only when they're getting good feedback. Like when they're not getting good feedback, like in most of the world, like people aren't getting unambiguously accurate feedback. Like lots of people believe that the election was stolen and that Trump was really the person who won it, and they're only going to trust the people who believe that too. And so it's like, I mean, I'm just like reinforcing basically what you said, but it seems like this is super applicable to the real world. It's just that most of the time, at least the things I think about, most of the time we're in the bad feedback environment where there's actually not, like in your experiment, you can say like, this is the right answer. And obviously in real life, we have that sometimes, but in many cases in real life, there's even dispute about what the right answer is. And in that case, you're never going to get unambiguous feedback. And so you're going to wind up exacerbating people's biases because they're going to selectively choose advisors.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think an experiment we want to do, but we haven't figured out quite how to do it, or an analysis of real world data, is differences in patterns of trust in those kinds of situations versus others, whether perhaps is more objective truth. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. I'm glad it's good to get. I'm interested in people's reflections on which is more like the world. Is it feedback or no feedback? And I think I agree there are important ones like politics or like policy decisions where actually the feedback is either delayed or absent in a sense. Also, it's so multiply determined that you effectively don't get feedback.
And just to add on that, like so after doing this work with Nick, I was discussing with Mirta Galesic in Santa Fe Institute this idea of like how experts emerge, and sort of capitalizing on this work. Like we were really like trying to figure out a simulation where there is like some sort of objective way of determining who's the expert, right? Like you can imagine like physics. I should not be qualified to have an opinion on physics or to be influential with physicists. But then like other opinions, like I don't know, music or politics, because there is like less a clear-cut definition of who's an expert or who's not. Now, like maybe these patterns of self-reinforcing biases might be playing out like a much stronger role on who emerges in the network as the leader, as the expert.
Mm-hmm. In the interest of time, maybe what I'll do is, rather than talk through the last part of the talk, which is on network infrastructure, I'll tell you what the story is, and we'll see if there's any time to kind of go into more detail or if that prompts any thoughts. But so what Nicolo's a key theme of Nicolo's work, right, is that individual agents might be doing something that for them is very sensible, but it can have unfortunate effects at a network level. What this other line of work looked at is how something that looks suboptimal for an individual might actually make sense at a network level. So it's kind of the opposite. So, and it's thinking about the way in which the properties of the world you find yourself in might mean that you do something that doesn't make sense when that behavior is looked at alone. And the behavior that's looked at alone is how people use advice. And the finding is that in many situations, people use advice less than they should, and this is the phenomenon of egocentric discounting. So that if I know what I think and I know what you think, I typically weight my opinion over yours about 3 to 1 or 4 to 1. In most of these experiments, this turns out to be not the right thing to do. And so the question has been, why do people do it? And what is it that means that we tend to egocentrically discount when we shouldn't? The story, and I'll just put the kind of next picture up just because it just give Matt Jackery the credit he deserves for doing this really interesting work, or what I think is really interesting work, is he was interested in the idea that actually egocentric discounting might make sense if you think about the properties of networks that people find themselves in. And so he looked at that in using evolutionary agent-based models. So now the idea is these agents are making decisions and they're going to reproduce or not according to how good their eventual decisions are in these social contexts by using advice or not. And so he looked at the circumstance under which egocentric discounting emerges as the dominant strategy, evolutionarily speaking. So as a measure of kind of what's adaptive or rational. And basically showed that some obvious situations in which this might happen do come out. So for example, if occasionally people will lie to you, but it can be really, really occasionally, it makes sense to egocentrically discount. So it might be that in your life, you never meet somebody who lies to you, but nevertheless, genetically, it's better for you to kind of slightly downweight everybody's opinion relative to your own. Or if people just make less of an effort when they're giving advice than when they're making decisions themselves. But also really interesting, I think, ones that even in a world where advisors are honest and competent, if they just communicate differently than you, and this is where kind of confidence comes in the sense that we know that when people give their opinions, they use confidence in idiosyncratic ways. So some people just always express themselves quite confidently and other people always unconfidently. And even if you just have that difference in communication, it turns out to be rational in the sense of evolutionarily the dominant strategy in this, to egocentrically discount, just because you can't translate what a person is saying into your kind of cognitive processing of what the truth is effectively. And so he showed that under those circumstances, with various plausible real world constraints on how people communicate and how they can use advice, egocentric discounting actually just comes out every time. And then we started to do experiments looking at that. So where, for example, if we prime people to be aware that people might lie, what we might expect is if that's a driver of this egocentric discounting, that people egocentrically discount more, even if in fact they think this advisor, the one that's currently in front of them, if I'm in a world in which people might lie, even if I think this person in front of me is honest, I discount them more than otherwise. So we were starting to look at then the way these network influences on decision-making might play out, where something that seems irrational, like egocentric discounting, actually emerges from as rational response to the world people find themselves in. So that's the 2-minute version of the last part of this talk, which I'll kind of go through the slides of just to get to the conclusion. Excuse me. So this idea that people make decisions using confidence in adaptive ways, in the ways that I've described as individual decision makers, but also in groups, but can lead to interesting interactions when we start to think about the way in which individuals fit in networks and networks influence individuals. And that's sort of something I'm quite interested in exploring further. And I'll leave it with that final one to thank you for your attention and thank all the various students and collaborators for that, for their help with all this work.
That was great, Nick. Thanks for such a great presentation and for managing to get it all done in a timely fashion, despite us giving you the delay at the beginning. And thanks to all of our panelists for being here today and for asking great questions, and to all of our audience members for being here as well. This has been a lot of fun. All right, everybody, enjoy your weekend, and we will see you all again next week.